Heavenly Father, I want to thank you for allowing us to get here, together here this afternoon to do work that's going to be beneficial to this community. I'm asking you to provide us the knowledge, the wisdom, and the patience to work with each other in order to move forward with this. Amen.
So, for those of you all who don't know me, my name is Cherie Davis Faulkner. I'm the Director of Community Engagement with the Westside Communities Alliance. This is session 2 of our Westside Communities Alliance Community Studio. How many times can you say community in 5 seconds? Ready, go. I'm really pleased today that we have Mike Dobbins, Professor of Practice at Georgia Tech College of Architecture. He's also been intimately involved with the Westside Communities Alliance since its inception. So he's been working with Mackenzie and I since we started. We have been talking about the opportunity for people to have longer amounts of time with Mike. We know that oftentimes you might see him on a panel and then you get to come up to the mic and ask one question and they say thank you and the session is over. So we figured that it makes a lot more sense that we can be creating opportunities for us to take the folks off the panels and give a little bit more time to dig into some of the issues that we're very concerned about. I want to do kind of a roll call so that we have a sense of who's in the room. So if we can start with this table, that would be wonderful.
Great. My name is Al Bartell. I am. Stand up, right?
Oh, sorry. Let me introduce the fact that Josh Peltier is here. I asked last week if people were okay with us filming one or two of the sessions, and people said yes. So we've invited Josh to help us document some of the work that we're doing. So we're just name and also the organization that you're representing. That would be perfect.
Sure. My name is Al Bartell. I am the chairperson of the Policy Action Committee for the Westside Atlanta Land Trust, which is a program of the health organization over for the Vine City and English Avenue communities.
My name is Frank Simmons, and I'm president of the West End Merchant Coalition.
Hi, I'm Stephanie Travis with Georgia Stand Up.
I'm Patricia Gartrell. I'm a member of the Neighborhood Washington Community Historical Community Club.
Janelle, might as well go ahead and stand up.
Drunell Thomas with the Historic Weston Heights Bankhead Neighborhood Association.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Imran Batla. I'm a resident of the Historic West End. Here on behalf of the Proctor Creek Stewardship Council.
Hello, everybody. Rashawn Haldman with NPUK.
Hello, everyone. Mia Knowles with NPUT.
Linda Adams, resident of the Vine City neighborhood. Lisa Glover, representing the Northwest Business Alliance.
G. Dubois, representing the Vine City Civic Association.
Gil Frank, Historic Westside Garden, ATL.
Christy Jackson, Washington Park Community Club and Neighborhood Association, and the Conservancy of Historic Washington Park.
Kendrick Long with the Atlanta University Center Neighborhood Association.
My name is Jesse Phillips. I'm the secretary of the English Avenue Neighborhood Association.
Hi, I'm Peter Pankowicz, board member of the Historic Westside Cultural Arts Council, and we put on the Festival of Lights in English Avenue every year.
Greetings, everyone. Michael Johnson, representing Historic West End, Wynn Neighborhood Association.
Before you sit down.
Uella Calhoun from the West End Coalition Community.
Transit-oriented development is the idea that where you have a transit station, why don't you have people living, working, shopping right near the station instead of surrounding them with parking lots? And that's an idea that it's taken some years to get the Federal Transit Administration to really understand. And a good example of a reasonably recent, still in progress transit-oriented development is the development that's occurring around the Lindbergh Station. And the Lindbergh Station was set up back in '98, I guess, when Rick Simonetta was the manager of MARTA. to use that vast parking lot. Some of you might remember it. You could park 5,000 cars around the Lindbergh-MARTA station. And the idea was, okay, this is land that ought to be beneficially used to support housing needs and job needs and retail needs for the people in and out of the station. Sort of common sense. You get more people to ride MARTA if there's stuff around there where they can work or they can shop or whatever, and it supports the commercial development and the residential development in that area. So little by little, with the new manager at MARTA, the agency has begun to really lift its priority on doing something about transit-oriented development. So they hired Ken Bleakley, who's got an economic analysis firm, a couple years ago to help them assess the values of their 37 stations in the system. The problem with that was that the main criterion was, how can we, MARTA, best maximize our profits off our land holdings in these areas? So necessarily they could maximize their profits where rich people already live. So that was the way they got started. Then there was quite a bit of pushback. In fact, Georgia Stand-Up led some of the pushback and said, wait a minute, shouldn't we be meeting the needs of people who need transit access, who, you know, whether they're at the East Point station or whatever, to get those people to where they can get to work, whether they're working downtown or midtown, where most of the jobs are concentrated. And so they were able to work with the Enterprise Foundation and the Atlanta Regional Commission, and one of the handouts is the Atlanta Regional Commission's summary of the status of their Transit-Oriented Development Collaborative. And its goals are to recognize that you need money to invest in new buildings wherever you're going, but you also need to be responding to the needs of people for travel. And so they've started to bend MARTA's priorities a little bit in the direction of meeting people's needs where they are. And that's sort of the big context for the stations that we have here, all of which are quite different. One of the handouts I gave you is a fairly detailed set of information about who lives within a half mile of each of these 4 stations, how many jobs are there, what are the incomes, how many housing units are there, and other stuff that I just, you know, and it's a handout, it's got a different station on each page. It's this 2-pager that looks like this. So that's really, I think, worth studying, looking at, thinking about, trying to decide whether it's right or wrong, and trying to understand the larger framework in which the kinds of decisions about where to spend money to improve transit systems or encourage new development are going to occur. So that's this handout. And I think it's also the handouts on the table when you came in give even more information about each of these 4 stations, so that there's a pretty good database, and the students were not able to find anything fundamentally wrong with this database. This is just raw information, and in my view, it should make its way into all of you guys as leaders in this community to share information so that you can go, you know, I'm a lifelong bureaucrat, right? So I talk like a bureaucrat, and then sometimes we're pretty hard to understand. We can't even understand each other half the time. But nonetheless, it's possible to move people who are working for the government, whose purpose is to provide service, to better understand what the real priorities of the real people in a community like we live in, what they are. And not simply say, well, we're going to go where we can make the most money. We know that's the way it works. We also know that we need to have money, because you don't build things without money. This complex, I think, was supported by tax allocation district funding out of the Westside tax allocation district, this whole complex. So that's an example of finding sources of funds, in this case from tax allocation district, to support something that began to revitalize and stabilize this corner of the Westside neighborhood. The Atlanta Regional Commission handout is a 1-pager, both sides, and it describes how this transit-oriented development collaborative came about. I would give quite a bit of credit to Doug Hooker, who's the executive director of the ARC, for trying to be responsive to meeting the needs of the Westside neighborhoods. And so it was good that ARC stepped up and took a socially progressive position with respect to MARTA about how they should be prioritizing where they think about developing around the station. And the last one, which sort of looks like this, is a brand new newsletter, hot off the press, from the new manager of the transit-oriented development unit at MARTA. Her name is Amanda Ryan. She worked for many years for Invest Atlanta. She was the tax allocation district manager for Invest Atlanta, which used to be called Atlanta Development Authority. She's pretty knowledgeable about funding sources and uses. She's new on the job. She's only been there 2 or 3 months. She's open-minded. She's a former student, so she has to listen to me, right? And Mackenzie is too, by the way. But actually, Cherie's the boss of all of us. So.
How do I spell Amanda's last name?
R-H-E-I-N.
R-H-E-I-N. Okay.
Yeah.
And you said she's the what?
She's, I think her title is the manager of the Transit-Oriented Development Program at MARTA. And by the way, all this stuff and all that stuff over there is on MARTA's website. So if you want to go on the website, if you want to exhaust 3 or 4 cartridges of colored ink, you can print the stuff off. And but I'm not going to go into much detail on this, but I do think that we should be thinking about, you know, here's something that, in particularly working with English Avenue in Vine City, through really starting a 1.5 years ago and working through the whole Falcons mix-up stuff. One of the things that Vine City and English Avenue struggle with is understanding where common interests lie and how to put the common interests ahead of the sub-interests, all of which are legitimate. There are a lot of different people who have good ideas and have real needs and are willing to work on it, but then there's someone else also with a different set of needs and priorities. How do you get these different sub-communities to get together to impress upon the decision makers, which is really the city council, to do the right thing? City council has quite a lot of authority, quite a lot of power. They approve these kinds of things. They approve zoning. They approve funding. They approve the Falcons' abandonment of Martin Luther King, and partly because the way the issue was brought to them was a little piece here. Well, we just want to move this street a little bit. That doesn't sound too bad. Well, we just want to move this street a little bit. Well, that doesn't sound too bad either. Well, now we want to move this little street. Well, all right. Then it's all done. They moved all the streets, bringing to the council, not sharing the information the council deserves to have in terms of informing themselves about what they're going to vote on. And that was an unfortunate situation. So I say that to say that Bankhead has a certain set of needs and a certain set of prospects about what can happen around the Bankhead station. There's been a significant number of studies around the Bankhead station in conjunction with the Beltline about how it might develop, how DFAX might become an anchor for a larger scale development, some of it privately owned, some of it publicly owned, and whether that will happen. So that's one thing, and I want to introduce the idea that it's really important when you think about these 4 stations to think about timelines. What is realistically likely to be able to happen in 5 years, in 10 years, in 20 years? Bankhead is probably a number of years away because there are an awful lot of steps that have to happen before anybody gets attracted to make significant investment in Bankhead. Doesn't mean it's not a good project. It doesn't mean it won't happen. It's just really, and I say this to say that one of the best, in my experience, one of the best ways to overcome competition for scant resources in neighborhoods, you know, there's a relationship. The more you need stuff, the less the resources are available. Think of insurance. We need insurance, and the more you need it, the more expensive it is, the harder it is to get. So the timeline is a really good way of saying, okay, this might happen in 15 years. So then you've got the Ashby station, which actually is pretty promising. You've got the historic Westside Village, you've got some new townhouses, you've got this development, you've got the Yara Carter School, you've got a lot of assets, you've got Washington Park, you've got Mason Turner, you've got a lot of things that are happening right here. So maybe that moves it forward, and then you have to figure out how do we take best advantage of that. Do we want to continue to support the kind of development that Steve Brock has done recently in historic Westside Village, the townhouses and so on? Is that an appropriate kind of investment? Is that the kind of thing we want to encourage? How do we make sure that the income and cost levels are compatible with the people who are already living here? None of these are easy questions, but they're important to raise and they're important to discuss. Vine City is likely to be significantly influenced and impacted by the land acquisition that has occurred up and down the North Side corridor on this side of the street from the stadium and the World Congress Center's here, stadium here. So what happens there, and again, it's fascinating to me how the Falcons have managed to remove themselves from participation in these projects except at their will. In other words, there's nothing that obligates them to make any improvements to Vine City. Their attitude to the station, their attitude is, well, Marta City, you want to do that? That's cool. We'll cooperate with you. That they're not putting skin in the game, and that's frustrating for me as a former city administrator. And West End, I've begun to talk about a little bit. West End already has what it needs to. I mean, West End is a transit-oriented development. It just hasn't been defined that way. And the prospect for new residential development, for retail development, for office development, for building incubator space, for Morehouse School of Medicine, for connecting better to the Metropolitan. Y'all know the Metropolitan? Mr. Simmons, you know the Metropolitan. It used to be called Handler Warehouse. Exactly. That's the most bizarre piece of urban fabric I've ever seen in my life. If you haven't driven up in there, you need to drive up in there. You know what I'm talking about? It's that giant. It's amazing what's in there. I mean, they got audiovisual stuff, they got light industry, they got artists, they got people living there, and it's the kind of, if a student were to propose that that's the way to house anything, they'd fail. And yet there it is. It's there. And it's really cool. I mean, it needs a few trees, but, you know, other than that.
I think there are goats back there.
Goats back there.
Yeah, it's sort of like goat farm south.
My son with the goats, right.
So, you know, and I've talked to Amanda Ryan about the West End station several times, and basically I agree with her. You don't need to do much. They've already done some beautification and everything. It might be nice to, as development begins to occur and investment begins to happen in West End, it might be nice to use some of that land for retail fronting on Lee Street and on Ralph David Abernathy, so that you begin to have something right out the door of the MARTA station that has some value for the people who live there, the people who are riding on MARTA. You know, the station functions pretty well. It has a lot of traffic in it. It's a hub for a lot of bus lines. And the other thing, you know, from my point of view, this whole area over here, downtown, midtown, the Turner Field, another major project that I think I'm going to be working on some next semester with my students, along with the Memorial Drive corridor, is this becomes sort of the knuckle, the knee, the joint between the southwest neighborhoods and downtown. If we can improve the North Side Drive access in and out, if we can make Lee Street, I think the thing to think about at Lee Street is 5th Street, Georgia Tech to Midtown, because that was a harder project to do than this is. Because we've already got the bridge width we need to do plantings and landscaping and lighting and a good pedestrian system and bicycles into the AU Center campus. It's already there. We already have a much more vital and lively West End business district. I don't know how many of you remember the way Midtown was on the east side of the freeway before Tech Square came in. It was miserable. There were 2 or 3 buildings that had a little bit of stuff in it. Most of it was parking lots, broken glass, weeds, chain link fences broken down, an occasional syringe or condom lying around on the ground. I mean, that was what it was. And we don't have that problem in West End. West End is one of the bigger generators of sales tax in the whole region. It just, the connectivity just hasn't happened. And we think we've found some ways to make the connectivity to Atlanta University Center work better, to downtown work better, and then down Lee Street to Fort McPherson, which looks like the city's going to be taking over Fort McPherson. So West End becomes a really strategic sort of link and hub between the downtown core and the southwest communities and Fort Mac down to the airport.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. If you don't ask questions, you're going to have to listen to me for another 2 hours. So.
You better break in here, because otherwise. Well, one of the things that we did was put all of the stations up, and we actually put some Post-it notes on the table. And what we'd be interested for you to do is to identify yourself and your organization, and which MARTA stations actually are kind of relevant for you. Like, which MARTA stations, if you had to use MARTA, which one would you use? Which one do you use? Which one are you keeping in mind? And we'd love for you to take a minute to take some of these Post-it notes and actually stick that up, because I think it would help us to get a better sense of how people are seeing these stations anyway. Because, you know, I think on some levels, a Northside Drive facing out into a major street is one thing. Ashby seems like it's more of a neighborhood, right, train station. Bankhead actually is on a major street as well, and so I'd be interested to hear what people's perceptions are of what it is and what it could be. And then the West End is very interesting because it services the neighborhood, it services the business district, but it also services the colleges and universities. So can we take a few minutes to have you all do that exercise and to help you move around after having a little bit of dinner, and then maybe come back together?
Yeah,
Okay.
just a couple of questions. And just one comment on that. It looks to me like at least a couple of you in this room have the great benefit of being able to ride MARTA for 85 cents a trip.
Yep.
That's a motive. That's a motive to get over.
Oh, I was like, 85 cents. No,
85 cents. If you make it to 65, you get an 85 cents. So a couple questions.
Quick question. I've read a few articles highlighting the improvements that are about to happen within like the Midtown station and a few other stations.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about that, specifically how the funding mechanism works? Is that through a CID mechanism? How is that going to happen?
That's a very relevant and great question, because it fits exactly with the role that a CID at West End could have over a period of time. Midtown Alliance is an old organization. It's been around, I think, since, I don't know, the mid-70s or something like that. They really weren't doing much of anything except sort of a group of the richer members of property owners in Midtown getting together and talking about this and that, running an ad campaign or a branding campaign. In 1996, which was right when I got here in 1996, they decided to enter into, and this is before they were a community improvement district. They were the Midtown Alliance. And so they first did what we're trying to regenerate now with the Livable Centers Initiative update for West End. And they did what they called a blueprints process. So they got all the members and owners and so on around to come together to say, well, what do we want it to be like? And they used a consultant named Anton Ellison. He'd show pictures about what's there now and some choices about what could be there now. And Midtown was a lot of parking lots 18 years ago. And so people responded positively, well, we want to see nice sidewalks. We want to see lights. We want to see trash receptacles. We want to see clean. We want to see safe. And yeah, we do want to see buildings that are accessible from the street. We don't want to look at parking lots. We want the cars out of sight. And they came up with these different goals for the whole of Midtown. Now, I participated in that, but my caveat for participating as the city in that exercise said, look, you know, you can't do any of this stuff without the city support. And you'll have the city support if you're careful to include not just the big property owners, but the lessors, residential, the neighborhoods next, that's NPUE. And if you include those even-handedly with the usual suspects or the usual big interests, then you can count on us to do whatever we need to do to help guide this process forward. So they did. They had a couple of old hippies on their board. And the old hippies remembered the day when people were supposed to be more equal than they'd become, right? And they were a little looser. So they were effective One guy had the Pleasant Peasant Restaurant. I mean, yeah.
Oh,
wow.
Yeah. So he was an old hippie, Steve Nygren. He's the guy that built Serenby in the Chattahoochee Hill Country in South Fulton. And he doesn't do Pleasant Peasant anymore.
Yeah.
But he had the right attitude, and there were some other board members. There are a lot of board members who said, we don't want those people in the room with us. But he was able to persuade his peers that, yeah, you do. In fact, one of the things I never was quite able to do is get Central Atlanta Progress to have an equally open-minded view about who should be guiding their fortunes. Anyway, we went through all that, and what the city did in the course of doing implementing the blueprint did two things, and this gets back to the CID role and the LCI role. We got the Atlanta Regional Commission to proclaim that the Midtown Plan met the criteria that they needed to be a livable centers initiative. We rezoned all of Midtown. It took us a couple years, but everybody knew what was going to happen. Everybody knew what was going to happen to the extent that when I went down to the zoning review board hearing on the zoning changes, I went by a property in Midtown that said, this property zoned SPI 13, whatever the number was. Well, it hadn't been rezoned. It was people were aware enough that it was going to be rezoned that, and we get, Bill Campbell, some of you might remember, wasn't real popular with the press or the elites. And so, to get that huge swath rezoned was phenomenal. So as that was happening, they formed a community improvement district. They had generated enough interest and enough momentum within their membership and even support from the neighborhoods, which is really important for the neighborhoods to support these initiatives, understand, okay, I live here and I got a problem with the cleaner. He messed up my shirt, so I don't like merchants. Or you got merchants saying, oh, I don't want to deal with that guy. He doesn't have any money. How's he going to buy something from me? And you got to bridge that gap, and they were able to do that. So we slammed through zoning changes that everybody knew about, except the press. If the press had found out about it when Bill Campbell was mayor, they'd have probably raised a big stink ahead of time and brought out a lot of people who said, oh, Anyway, that prompted them to realize that they needed some tax money that they controlled to begin to prioritize the public improvements that they wanted to make that came out of their visioning plan. Like 5th Street. I mean, 5th Street is partly Georgia Tech, it's partly Midtown Alliance, and the CID. So just fast forward, that community improvement district, obviously they have a huge tax base, which is growing, which means they have quite a lot of money. And their community improvement district has pretty good freedom on basically everybody pays property tax. Community improvement district, you pay a little bit extra. And whoever's in the game controls what you do with that money. So they balance their funding between Midtown Blue, which is their security force, Midtown Green, which is their cleanup force, and if you've driven through there recently, they're continuously taking little corners and pieces and parcels of land, building medians with plantings in them, getting the lights fixed on the streets that carry, reopening retail spaces, building stuff. And all that is usually combined money, but without the community improvement district money, they can bring a match. And I'll give you an example. So when we got ARC, the Atlanta Regional Commission, to agree that they would accept the blueprint plan and the city zoning actions and land use changes and comprehensive development plan changes to support this, then they qualified it for capital funding. So once you've got a plan that's consistent with the goals of the Livable Centers Initiative, which is to prioritize transit, walking, and biking over automobiles, once you get that plan, once you get the jurisdiction to adopt that plan, once you put the zoning in place to implement that plan, then you're eligible to get capital funding. So in the case of Midtown, when they first started, it used to be West Peachtree was a 6-lane street. Now it's a 4-lane street with planted areas on either side and on-street parking. The whole Piedmont along Piedmont Park was pretty raggedy. And so their first grant was $6.7 million, which they had to match. So their $6.7 million, they had to put up about $1.5 million to get that $6.7 million. And that's what they're doing at the transit stations. They're putting up front money in terms of designing, how do we make the North Avenue station more pedestrian friendly? How do we get it more active? How do we do the same thing at Midtown? How do we do the same thing at Arts Center? And that's CID money is the primer. And then they're able to get MARTA to support it and find other sources to support those kinds of investment. And by the way, all this stuff is complicated. There isn't any single source that does this stuff. You've got to look for, if we can move Northside Drive and get the on and off ramps at I-20 working, that's going to be mostly a GDOT funded project, but the city and others are going to have to kick in on it. And you want to kick in because otherwise GDOT will do it their way, which may not be the way you want it to be done.
Can I ask real quick? You said that everyone pays property tax. Who pays CID? Who pays that?
The property owners.
Commercial owners. The commercial owners.
Commercial owners?
Commercial property owners.
Commercial property owners, okay.
How much, I understand what CIDs are, but how much does that typically run in terms of compared to your total property tax bill? What kind of scale is that money? In other words, what kind of impact does that have on the commercial property owner in Midtown? Are you paying $10,000 a year? What is that maybe?
Shahid, or you might be more. I think the number is like an extra mil.
Yeah, the extra mil.
A mil, up as high as 3 mil.
Yeah, it's flexibility up to 3 mil.
Perimeter is a little bit higher, but look what they do.
Right.
Yeah, Buckhead, strong CID.
I think Janelle had a question before.
I do have a question about, there was an LCI study done up there at Bankhead.
Right.
And there was one done at Westlake.
Right.
And West End LCI studies have been done. But not much has happened in terms of helping those plans to become a reality, unlike what has happened over in Midtown. So what do you do when a lot of persons like me live in the area and speculators have bought up a lot of individual housing in the areas and has driven property values down? So how do we actualize improvements in these areas of heavy it's investment or disinvestments, really?
That's a tough question. I'll tell you what we're finding in West End, in contrast to English Avenue and Lion City. First of all, there is speculative activity going on everywhere. Typically, the speculators or the bank-owned properties don't keep their places up, and the effect of that is to depress land values and property values. And that certainly happened big time in English Avenue and Lion City.
And Weston Heights.
And Weston Heights.
Which is
never
probably the
Weston
worst.
Heights, should I?
Historic Weston Heights. Nobody, that's why you have a Historic Weston Heights Bankhead Neighborhood Association, because it's the forgotten land, but not forgotten by some.
So what I want to say really quickly, though, is that we also have a session that's really focused on housing. So we have two. We have one that's going to be focusing on housing and what's happening in terms of speculation and that sort of piece. But we also have one that's going to be focusing on moving from plan to implementation. So I want to hold that, and I want to make sure that we really dig in while we have Mike around transit to dig in around transit-oriented development as much as possible.
One more piece about transit, because that area right there at Martyr, at the Maddox Park, some improvements have been made by DOT, the Georgia DOT, which was a part of that plan. But somehow it seems to have gotten shortchanged in what was originally planned, because I remember being a part of those discussions and what has actually happened. So how do we hold people accountable for what they say they're going to do and what they actually do?
That gets me right back to the Falcons. They've said a lot of good stuff, but they haven't bound themselves to follow up. It's really the city's job. And I was telling Al and Mr. Simmons that when I was in Birmingham, I learned strategy, which Ms. Thomas, I think, is an excellent example of. You've got to be persistent. You got to be patient, and you got to be pleasant, and never quit, and be pleasant, and you can make stuff happen, but you can't do it. One person can't make it happen. It takes four or five people can begin to make it happen. And there's so much going on in your neighborhoods right now. Do you have a session on the whole Proctor Creek watershed plan?
Well, we have, possibly have one that's specifically going to look at environment and health collectively as it relates to the Proctor Creek watershed.
One of my students just finished his research paper on the Proctor Creek watershed, and I'm going to make sure that you get it and we distribute it. It's well written, and it begins to describe strategies that can generate reinvestment. I mean, the simple answer to your question is there isn't a market. I'm sure you've heard that. There isn't a market. And the reality is, as much as we might be unhappy with the fact that the private sector only gauges its success by how much profit they can make, nothing happens without private investment. So you've got kind of a contrast. So the LCI at Bankhead was supposed to have generated some interest among investors. And I think it will, but it's way down the road. And it's dependent on a lot of things that might or might not happen, like the Westside Park and the Beltline and that kind of thing. Might happen, might not. How much impact is it going to have? There won't be any transit there for years. I mean, the Bankhead station is the transit for that area, and that should be a real plus. In fact, the Bankhead station was supposed to be the beginnings of a link that went through Vinings and became a commuter rail out in Cobb County. But you know as well as I do why Cobb County didn't like that idea.
And there's no private money in that area. And that has made the
That's
difference.
right. So,
you know, that's the other part of it. There is no private money down there. That's what you have down on the other side of Mount David Abernathy. A wonderful area. African American businesses are doing quite well, much better than on Martin Luther King. In those section over there, much better than over in Joe Boone. You do have an economic base there. We don't have it in the Western. We hope that's what the CID and the West Side of the CID is attempting to do. But right now you don't have it. You have that private fund, those private funds that make a difference.
right. And you know, the historic Westside Village was a project that made sense on the face of it back when I was at the city, 1997, 98. And you know, I have to say this bluntly, the only reason it didn't take off and go at the time is basically race and the traditions of race that have basically controlled how the city works. It's also a class issue because the market is here. It's just that the market wasn't accepted by the people who had the money to invest in it. I think that's changing. I think it's changing in a positive way, and I think it's really important for communities to organize to shape how that investment happens instead of just letting it happen willy-nilly. Yeah.
I was sort of interested in when we were talking about MARTA and sort of, I guess, sort of how it sort of connects to what's around its stations. You know, like sometimes when I think of Ashby Station, I use MARTA, you know, pretty frequently. So when I think about Ashby Station, there's sort of one bus that runs from here, and there's nothing that sort of takes you down Joseph Lowry. And so I see so much walking traffic sort of walking down Lowry. Now I see some of the same, say for instance off Abernathy, sort of moving into Cascade or down MLK corridor here. So what I'm sort of pushing towards is in the sense of, I get the belt line and the lightweight rail, but in terms of what will be the process or how can you move sort of, I guess, taking a look at that in some areas that I think where it could be more used or more beneficial to some of the people who ride transit, sort of as, I can understand lightweight rail running Abernathy to Cascade. I can understand it running MLK. I can understand it running Joseph Lowry because there's so many people who use the transit there and it seems like there's that base there. But I don't really see anything that's sort of exploring the opportunity of putting some type of lightweight rail on some of these main corridors.
Well, at one point there was discussion about having the trolley come down, the streetcar, but over to West End and down MLK to go to West End and Grant Park and the stadium, but that got nixed in the plans.
Yeah, and I think,
as far as light rail and transportation, going through the AU Center.
Right.
well, and I think there again, that could be something that happens. It's a long way out.
Yeah, long.
But specifically to your comment, I mean, you're absolutely right. Transit should go where people need to go and are trying to get. The Beltline doesn't do that. The Beltline wasn't designed to meet people's travel needs. Where do people go? They don't go from Cascade to Washington Park. They go to downtown, midtown, AU Center, Georgia Tech, World Congress Center. You know, you don't want to get me started on the Beltline. The Beltline, okay, it's a nice trail for people who really like trails, where it's working. 2/3 of the money that they've generated has been spent in the neighborhoods that are among the most affluent in the Beltline area. The idea of building now a trail in the southwest sector, which requires somehow tearing down all the trees that are already there, doesn't make any sense. There won't be transit on the Beltline in my lifetime. Now, I've told you how old I am, but I'm giving you some idea, but it doesn't make sense, and you don't get funding to carry people. We had one of the foremost transit experts in the country, if not the world, because he also worked in Toronto's transit system. He ran Toronto's system. He ran SEPTA, which is Pennsylvania. He ran the New York transit system. And he came down and met with Beverly Scott, who was the manager at the time, and people were trying to convince him on how great the Beltline was. And so he went out and spent a couple days analyzing everything and saying, well, you know, if, first of all, you build that, you're wasting a lot of money because you don't have the trips, you don't have the origins and the destinations, you don't have, in transportation language, the productions and attractions, where you live, where you work, where you shop, where you go to hospitals. All that is concentrated in downtown and midtown. Nobody's going to take the Beltline to get to downtown or midtown because it doesn't get there. So what he said was, in conclusion, he says, if you actually are crazy enough to try to implement a transit system around the Beltline, you're going to have to pay the operators loneliness pay. So it isn't a project that meets the needs right now that our people have right now. And it's actually one of the things that I'm sure Mr. Simmons and others in the West End are aware of this. The Beltline Tax Allocation District, which is another source of funds, covers the whole of the West End Business District. And I had a brief conversation with the guy who runs the Beltline now, but hey, would you think about beginning to prioritize some of your expenditures where the needs really are, as opposed to building a trail down White Street or whatever? And he wasn't really thinking that way. But that's another area where the CID, the Merchants Coalition, WEN, NPUT, can begin to get together and say, you know, we've got this public money that you're controlling. We've got these needs. We want to extend the Ralph David Abernathy Improvement Project. We want to improve the bridge over to the Metropolitan. We want to contribute to this Lee Street thing. You got money, why can't you partner with us to meet needs we have right now? Instead of talking about something that might happen. It's sort of a nice to do, maybe in the future, but it doesn't meet needs, and we're not meeting the needs. You know, we have 20% of our population basically running from Bankhead through southeast Atlanta, where the median family income is like $25,000 per year, which is close to poverty, where we have 40% unemployment. Why aren't we putting the resources we have to meet the needs that we have? And that's part of this whole conversation. Yeah.
Can you tell me what happened? It seemed like in the 60s and 70s, Atlanta had this slogan, they wanted to be the next great international city, or the city too busy to hate. And it seemed like things were initiated without the median salary cap being there per se first. Now it seems like that spirit is backwards. It seems like we're waiting for the median or the salaries to be there first versus the visions that we had back in the 60s and the 70s. Do you think that's because of the type of leadership we have, or how do you see us getting back to we invest in things first and the people will come?
It wasn't the 60s and 70s, it was later, 80s.
Well, I think, you know, the city too busy to hate happened at the end of the 60s. I've been here 3 weeks for, I thought, well, maybe it's a city too busy to hate. It certainly lives within a region with time on its hands. And that hurts the city too. So, actually what we were trying to do with the Falcons, and this is something that Stephanie's worked on, maybe some others, you guys worked on, is to is to get some real measurable improvements. How many jobs, how much training, an attitude that takes the people we have and shapes the job to what they can do, instead of saying, oh, you don't qualify. Oh, you had a drug arrest. Oh, you had some other kind of arrest. Oh, you're on something. We've got to get past that. Some of you, this is actually a really important comparative story. Some of you might remember the Olympics. Were you around during the Olympics? Some of you might remember that when the Olympics, which was Atlanta Committee for the Olympic Games, which is the private organization that basically generated the Olympics, they were getting ready to build the Olympic Stadium, part of which is now Turner Field. And there was a coalition of neighborhood leaders at that time. Some of you might know some of these people. A man named Columbus Ward in Peoplestown, who was the chairman of NPUV. A man some of you may have heard of named Vincent Ford, who was the president of the Atlanta Planning Advisory Board, APAB. And a guy named Stuart Acuff, who was worked at the North Georgia Labor Council. And the three of them were able to get together, organize grassroots people, union people, which is sometimes hard to do. I can speak to that because I used to be a carpenter in the Carpenters Union. But that was a long time ago. But what they were able to do was to gain enough momentum to oblige ACOG to set aside jobs, community employment program, with numbers, and without disqualifying people because of either arrests or substance abuse. Provided those people stayed out of trouble and stayed clean, they could get a job. So there were 250 jobs created and filled from neighborhoods around NPUB and elsewhere, managed by APAB and particularly by the North Georgia Labor Council. And so that's an example on the books. That was actually 20 years ago because that construction started in '94. We tried to use that model to get the Falcons and the city council to say, hey, you know, Vine City English Avenue, high unemployment, why can't we set some numbers? You know, even a few numbers, you know, 10 people, 20 people. Write down, commit yourself to doing that. And actually one of the things I'm working on right now, I don't know how many of you are familiar with the movement, the environmental movement, which really didn't get kicked off until the 60s when a lot of movements got kicked off. And they've been able to progress fairly rapidly toward getting established standards, you know, for what they call the Leadership in Energy and Environmental Development. It's called LEAD. And that program gives developers credits for recycling, for energy, reduction of energy costs, for green materials, and it's an inducement for you know, a much more sustainable, energy efficient, water efficient, air efficient buildings. And that program didn't get instituted until 1998. That's not very long ago. And initially the developers, oh, we're not going to do that. We don't want to do that. That's going to cost us, and so on and so forth. Well, over the 18 years using these LEED standards, now developers are jumping up and down saying, oh, I'm LEED Gold and I'm LEED Platinum, and they're competing over instituting these measurable, you get percentages for, if you do this, you get 10% point. That's pretty quick. So I've got this idea, which I call Standards for Equitable Living, and the acronym is SEQUEL. And the idea is, let's set some standards right now of jobs, infrastructure, so that when publicly supported, publicly funding projects go forward, a piece of that, by law, has to go into the communities that are being impacted by the expenditure. That would apply to the Beltline, the stadium, the multimodal station, Fort McPherson. And if we could get something like that in, and everybody, even my colleagues who are usually progressive people down at Georgia say, oh, the developers will never accept that. Well, we've heard about equal employment opportunity. That was resisted, fought, not going to do it. Disadvantaged business enterprise, that was fought, resisted, not going to do it. Go back further, building codes. You know, back in the day, even now in rural counties, we don't want building codes. We don't want zoning. All these things have had points of resistance that the development community, the private community has figured out how to get around, work with, and make work for it. So we really need to start, and I think that begins to answer the question of what about these ideas of equity. The other thing I need to say about that is that there's an organization called the Reason Foundation, or Reason Institute, in Southern California, funded by, what's the guy's name? I forgot his name. But they started in the late 70s to essentially attack government as a way of, you've all heard of privatization. What privatization means is they collect all our money, they flow it through the government, and the government has contracts to do this, that, and the other thing, and more of that money is fueling this 1% group. The divide between rich and poor is ever widening, and it's because of privatization. The government is supposed to be measured by service. The private sector's got to be measured by profit. And our goal is to improve the quality of our lives. And when you have, I've got a new image which make the private sector look like Pac-Man and the government look like the target. Because that's basically what's happened. We've gone from a democracy of one person, one vote, which we haven't had that long, and now the Supreme Court's overturned, to $1, one vote. You got $1, you got a vote. I got $1 million. And you know, we can't, I don't think this is sustainable. I have to say that I was on a program with Penny McPhee, who's the executive director of the Blank Family Foundation, and I just posed a question. I said, is inequity sustainable? And I'm proposing it isn't. We're going to fracture our society if these things keep going. She agreed. So, you know, so again, I think the Blank Foundation, its leadership, they got this new guy, Frank Fernandez, you got him coming? Ought to get him to come.
We're going to do this for a little while.
Good idea. So it's not the words that are so bad. It's the unwillingness to sign up and say, okay, I think we ought to have a job program, a pipeline. They even have a pipeline. Okay, well, what are your metrics? How many people are going to get in that pipeline? How many people are going to hire? How much are you going to orient? You know, there isn't anybody living in English Avenue, Vine City who can't do something. Why don't we merge what they can do with what they think they need? And that's what happened with the Olympic Stadium 20 years ago. We're not doing that anymore.
Mike, go ahead.
I have a question about, talking about how rail isn't getting people where they need to go, especially on the west side. What do you see opportunities for BRT systems on the side?
BRT is a bus rapid transit, which is an enhanced bus, basically, that runs in its own vein, and it's a more attractive vehicle, and you can get on and off, get your tickets, get on. You don't have a lot of the hassle. One of our steps in the direction of making Northside Drive, and you said, you know, Lowry, whoever said Lowry, you can't go up and down Lowry on a bus. That's crazy.